Story 1, Gary Oldman. I met him on the Washington, D.C. Metro. When he noticed that I recognized him, I pointed and said, "You don't like Beethoven." He instantly smiled, embraced his character, and responded, "You're a Mozart fan?" I love Mozart. We laughed, shook hands, and he excitedly explained that he was going to visit museums. Story 2. Eddie Vedder was in the parking lot after a Pearl Jam concert in 2009 in Philadelphia. He could not have been more friendly and down to earth. I was pregnant at the time, and he congratulated me and asked to touch my belly. He shared that his daughters were the greatest thing that had ever happened to him. He smelled like shampoo, cigarettes, and wine. Story 3. Walton Goggins is kind of shy but very friendly. He was working outdoors and thanked my coworker and me for coming out. He also asked how we were holding up in the cold. Story 4. Tom Waits made my sister eggs once. She was a teenager around the same time as his son and ended up at his house for a party. Story 5. Mr. Bigglesworth. Yes, Dr. Evil's hairless Sphinx cat. I was a cable technician in Southern California and visited a large house with a fine study filled with photographs and memorabilia. I noticed the cat and remarked, "Hey, he looks just like Mr. Bigglesworth." They informed me that this was indeed the real deal and gave me a tour of photographs from the set of Austin Powers, red carpet events, limousine rides, Mike Myers, and many more celebrities. I was allowed to hold him for a few minutes. I have met a few celebrities, but this one was the best. Story 6. Dennis Rodman. It was 11 a.m., and he was drunk at a local bar and grill. I was 18 years old, and my mom made me go up to him and ask for a picture. I refused multiple times, but after she urged me, I knew I had to go. I approached him apprehensively, saying, "Mr. Rodman, could I please take a picture with you?" He replied, "Why would I want to take a picture with you?" My mom said, "Come on, that's my son." To which Rodman responded, "Forget your son." Then, at that moment, he embraced me and gave me a playful slap on the back. I faced two options. Do I slap him back or give him a light tap and exit the situation? I decided to slap him back. He responded and we went back and forth about 3 times. He then said, "Man, that's pretty good. Let's get a picture." At that point, my mom took the blurriest picture of me and Dennis Rodman ever. Story 7. I met Ewan McGregor and told myself I wouldn't quote Star Wars. But without thinking I said, "Hello there." There was a long, very quiet pause before he asked, "Did you just hello there me?" Then he laughed, walked off, and in the Obi-Wan voice said, "Hello there." Story 8. I saw Keanu Reeves at an airport once. I panicked, dropped my phone, and he picked it up and said, "Whoa." Felt like I was blessed by a gentle wizard. Story 9. Jack Black. We stayed in the same hotel, and he looked at me in the elevator and said, "Mine is bigger than yours," referring to his beard. He took selfies of us so I could show my kids, and we chatted for a while. I made him laugh, and he called me hilarious. It was certainly a memorable experience, and he was so kind and relaxed. Story 10. I once saw LL Cool J at Amoeba Records in Hollywood. He was looking at a Jay-Z concert DVD, checked the price, and then put it back down. Story 11. I used to be a fishing guide near Yellowstone National Park and have taken Ed Harris fishing in the park close to a dozen times. I didn't know who he was the first few times, and one day someone recognized him and asked for a photo. He obliged, and we continued on our trip. We had the almost awkward but comical conversation about the situation, and he told me he was an actor. I watched several of his movies over the next few weeks. He was always polite, tipped well, and was a good fisherman who surely appreciated our services. I will always remember our trips together fondly. Story 12. Danny DeVito stepped on my foot in a coffee house at 2:30 in the morning in New Jersey. He apologized, and that was that. Story 13. Jason Momoa. I jokingly said I was going to fight him, and he replied, "Square up. He is a super nice guy." Story 14. Kyle MacLachlan, Aaron Paul, and Bryan Cranston were all very polite and humble, but they also had a personable quality that made the interactions more engaging. Story 15. Martin Luther King Jr. My mom was his wife's secretary, and my dad worked for him in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He held me when I was born and told my mom I was a fine-looking baby. Stevie Ray Vaughan. I waited outside the backstage door with my guitar, asking him to sign it. I met him and his wife. He spent 30 minutes with me after playing a show and was very humble while I rambled about how he was my idol and the greatest. Story 16. I've met many famous people through my old job, but the nicest I ever met was Vincent Price, a warm, kind, and friendly man. Story 17. I had to use the restroom during an intermission at a hockey game. While I was there, James Hetfield of Metallica approached the only open urinal next to me and also started using it. No words were spoken because that would have been strange. I am now part of a small statistic, having shared that experience with a legendary rock star. Story 18. Jennifer Lopez. I volunteered for the Make-A-Wish Foundation about 20 years ago and was the handler for the children who would meet the celebrities. One child wanted to meet Lopez, and to be kind, she was not the friendliest that day. She seemed disinterested and distant with the kids. Story 19. Bill Murray and I had a humorous interaction. I am 5 feet 1 inch tall and he is quite tall. I asked if we could take a selfie, and when he didn't attempt to fit into my frame, I suggested that he could bend down a bit. He responded by saying, "It's not my fault that you're a pygmy." Story 20. I am from a city known for high-end tourism, so I have encountered several famous people. The one who stands out the most is Arnold Schwarzenegger. He attended a Kennedy family event at a resort where I worked. He relaxed at the outside bar, chatting with everyone, and was completely down to earth. He was also a generous tipper. This was around 1994. Additionally, I found Bill O'Reilly to be quite unpleasant. Story 21. John Delancey, known for playing Q on Star Trek, is easygoing and friendly. He talked about music. On the other hand, Eric McCormick from Will and Grace was rude. Story 22. Tommy Lee was at a Jack in the Box drive-thru in my hometown. He was in a Lamborghini, and I shook his hand as he placed his order before I walked away. Story 23. Neil Patrick Harris worked in a burger restaurant across the pond a while ago while filming for Doctor Who. I am a big fan of How I Met Your Mother, so I was ecstatic when he showed up. He returned to the restaurant a second time with his family. I got to meet his husband, and the whole family was really cute. His kids ordered the salad, and it was a nice experience. Despite all the odd things you hear about him, it was a pleasant experience, and it was nice to meet Barney Stinson. Story 24. I responded to a similar question a few days ago, saying that living and working in retail as a student in London, one frequently encountered celebrities. On the whole, most were very polite and tolerated the stares, questions, and requests for autographs admirably. The celebrity in question did know me as I attended the same school as 2 of his sons. But John Deacon stands out as the most generous in terms of his time and willingness to answer questions. Many of the elite footballers and athletes active during that period were really pleasant too. The actors and politicians were very hit or miss, however. As for the musicians, some were charming, while others, like Mick Jagger and Bob Geldof, were quite unpleasant. I played guitar in a band during my younger years but pulled out of a gig we had at a pub in Richmond one evening due to illness. After the gig, my friends came around, absolutely buzzing with excitement, repeating, "You'll never guess what happened." They went on to recount how, during the set, specifically during the part when we played a few Led Zeppelin classics, a friend who had stood in for me was off form while playing Whole Lotta Love. An unassuming guy sitting in the corner approached the band, took the guitar off my friend, and began shredding like a god. It was Jimmy Page. He proceeded to play for another 30 minutes. Then, when they moved on to some cream, put the guitar down, finished his pint, and left. Story 25. I don't know about the most famous, but Reba was my lunch regular when I worked at a steakhouse in Las Vegas. I took care of her for years. She was an absolutely wonderful woman, sincere, kind, and genuine. I loved her deeply. She surrounded herself with people who were the same. Her agent, personal assistant, and anyone else who accompanied her were all cut from the same cloth. Brooks and Dunn included. They were awesome guys as well. Story 26. Queen Elizabeth was fine. Prince Philip was actually pretty friendly as well. Eugene Levy engaged in a casual conversation with fellow travelers at the airport while trying to decipher the announcement over the public address system. Norm Macdonald and Bob Saget were at a bar. Norm borrowed my Elvis Zippo and asked to buy it from me. I told him it was a gift from my late father, and he advised me not to sell it. Story 27. Bob Hope taught him how to drive a go-kart designed to look like an F-16, so he could drive it on stage. They partied backstage with Three Dog Night and sat next to Lee Greenwood at Brooke Army Hospital in the cafeteria. Story 28. I met Neil Armstrong. He was being deposed for a lawsuit that I was defending. He is more impressive in person than even his reputation. Story 29. Melissa Joan Hart. My child reached into her snack cup and took goldfish crackers before I could stop her. Melissa was really sweet. We chatted for a bit and went to different areas. My friend had to tell me who she was afterward. She is a lovely person and seems like a great mom based on my limited interaction. Story 30. I have met many famous people over the years, and the person I admired the most was Anthony Bourdain. I worked with him for about 3 to 4 months at a restaurant in New York City before he became famous. He was a wonderful chef to work for and a great person to have drinks with after work. Story 31. I have met a few well-known people. However, the only one with whom I had more than 5 seconds of interaction was Steven Tyler. I was working at a concert and saw him talking to someone who was looking for a lighter. I called out from the other side of the barricade and tossed him one. They both approached me and we had a normal chat. He seemed very grounded and thanked me for my work before they left. Story 32. Paul Newman. I was outside taking a smoke break when he walked by and stopped. He said, "You know those things will stunt your growth." I was 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 225 pounds. Story 33. John Candy wrote a personalized joke on a napkin and signed it. He invited me to join him and Eugene Levy for a drink, but I chickened out and thanked him. He was very generous with his kindness. Story 34. I had drinks with Trent Reznor in the French Quarter back in 1995. He was a humble and grateful person. Story 35. I met Val Kilmer at a screening of Tombstone, held in a ghost town outside of Austin. He was very nice but still struggled to speak. Rest in peace. Story 36. George Michael was outside the Sony studio in London around 1991. It was pouring rain and I had a flat tire. He helped me change the tire in the rain and offered to give me money for a new tire, but I wouldn't accept it. I was 21 or 22 and amazed that someone famous would know how to do something as simple as changing a tire. If I didn't admire him before that day, I certainly did afterward. He was one of the nicest people I have ever met. I was devastated when he passed away. Story 37. John Mellencamp and Meg Ryan were dating at one time. I live in the same town as him and was running a restaurant that he frequented during bad weather days. I would know before he came in because it would be a blizzard or nearly a tornado, and that was when he would go out to avoid people. He has a reputation in this town for being rude, but was always fun with me. Don't get me wrong, the guy is a grump, but if you respond in kind, he loves it and will laugh. One of his children was dating one of my employees, and they would come in by themselves frequently. Meg Ryan came in looking for the kids, walked in, looked at me and said, "Where are they?" with the look of an angry stepmother who didn't sign up for this. I pointed to them, and that was that. Story 38. I visited Erewhon, a fancy grocery store in Los Angeles, when a heavily tattooed man approached me while I was waiting for the bathroom. He politely explained that his daughter needed to use it and asked if he could go ahead. I agreed, and they went inside. It then occurred to me that the man was David Beckham. When he came out, he graciously thanked me. Story 39. I met Charlie Watts in a bar in Paris. He was charming and funny. "Excuse me, are you Charlie Watts?" "No, I'm David Bowie." I didn't want to be a bummer, so that was pretty much the extent of our conversation. Story 40. Back when Clint Eastwood was filming Gran Torino, I was a college student working at Einstein Bagels in a Detroit suburb when he came in. It was a very normal interaction, and I was not told to get off his lawn. Story 41, Johnny Depp, I suppose. The Met in Paris. I'm not a celebrity-loving person. Far from it. This is how it happened. I was standing in the sweltering heat, looking at my phone, deciding which direction I wanted to go. I turned around, and there was this guy about 6 feet 10 inches tall blocking me. I turned the other way, and Johnny was next to me. He smiled at me, and I said, "How's it going?" He replied, "Terrific," or something like that. I said, "Sorry there," as I passed him. I saw him the following day. I think we were staying at the same hotel. I couldn't get into my hotel because of the crowd waiting to greet him. Some people were practically passing out and overly excited. In fairness, he greeted every person there, shaking hands, taking photos, giving autographs, the whole lot. I don't understand the hype around celebrities. Story 42. Probably John Oliver. He was an extremely nice person. After a Knicks game, I passed by the celebrity exit. Amy Schumer hurried to a limousine and pushed a fan out of the way. Chris Rock had a police escort. John Oliver lingered and asked every single person if they wanted a picture or autograph. Then he walked off by himself. A good guy. I also met Gerard Way in 2007 at the height of his fame, backstage at Project Revolution. He was a super cool and humble person. Story 43. At 13, I was pulled from the crowd to dance on stage in Cork with the Prodigy. Leroy was being quite inappropriate, staring at me from the stage, and Keith was incredibly intoxicated. I danced like I was in outer space, and as I left the stage, another act called The Fourth Dimension was waiting. The lead singer pinched my backside. It was the very early 90s, so I had no idea anything was wrong with that. Story 44. Ben Stein at a trade show 20 years ago was the nicest guy ever. He gave me an autographed book titled Tommy and Me. Story 45. John Goodman. I used to work in his apartment building. He is a genuinely good person. He would come home really late from rehearsals and spend some time with us. Story 46. Flavor Flav was at the mall when I was a kid. He was shopping with his daughter. He was very friendly, giving my sister and me a hug and letting us take a picture with him. Story 47. Not counting any casual meet and greet events, I met Mia Farrow once at a very small gathering. She was very sweet and kind. Story 48. Dave Matthews, if you don't count the time I yelled at Sean Kemp. I yelled at his back because he was rude and wouldn't move so I could get a newspaper. But Dave Matthews was a gem. My infant son bumped into him in line at a drugstore. When that man turned around, I nearly died. He was so charming. His twins are my son's age, and he was away from them on tour. He played with my boy and we talked about kids. Story 49. Keanu Reeves is a really nice person. He dislikes answering questions, so he asked me about myself. It was very pleasant to talk to him, and he had an amazing scent, which I know sounds strange, but I couldn't ignore it. Story 50. Bruce Willis visited our table at Planet Hollywood when I was in 7th grade. He was very kind to my family and me. I was amazed that he spent a few minutes saying hello. Even though he was promoting a movie at the time, he was still very personable and gracious. Story 51. I attended high school with Pedro Pascal. He was the nicest person you could ever meet and always brought fun to our group. We were part of a performing arts high school filled with very talented individuals. However, he stood out to me even back then. Most of us wanted to be actors and singers, but I remember him expressing his desire to become a famous director, which seemed like next-level thinking for a high school student. Story 52. Pierce Brosnan in the 90s at Los Angeles International Airport. What a handsome individual. I was starstruck. He had just finished one of his Bond films and carried a certain swagger. I was an active duty Marine and was in uniform. He purposely stopped, shook my hand, gave a wink, and then moved on. Story 53. I worked at a toy store in Las Vegas in the 1990s when Demi Moore came in close to closing time and purchased a couple of $1,000s worth of dolls. It took a little while, and I mentioned to one of my coworkers that I would be late for my ride home and didn't have a way to contact him. She asked for a piece of paper and wrote a note apologizing for disrupting my ride home, which I later forgot was in my pocket and accidentally washed. She was very enthusiastic about dolls and laughed and smiled frequently. Story 54. Nelson Mandela was here to receive the Nobel Prize in 1993. I met him at an event related to his receiving the prize. He visited a school where I worked, and it went well. Mandela was as nice as you would imagine him to be through the media. We exchanged a few words, and I asked him how his journey to my country had been. I received a handshake, though I washed my hands afterward. It's hard to wrap my head around the fact that he spent 27 years in prison without any signs of bitterness or revenge. He is not just the most famous, but perhaps the greatest. Story 55. Ronnie Wood of the Rolling Stones took me to his private pub, where he taught me about gambling on horses and showed me his extensive guitar and art collection. He is a true gentleman. Story 56. I met George Lucas while he was having dinner next to us. My stepmom, who was drunk as usual, pointed at him and loudly said, "Is that George Lucas?" He replied, "I don't know. Is that Kenny Rogers?" and pointed back towards my dad. Dad looked like Kenny Rogers, and it was an ongoing joke. I'm sure he did not appreciate my stepmom pointing him out so loudly, but he did sign an autograph for me. Story 57. I was with my Swiss and tiny aunt and my cousins in Banff, Alberta. Vince Vaughn was standing in front of us at the famous downtown crosswalk, waiting to cross. My cousins got excited when they recognized him and whispered, "Oh my God, that's Vince Vaughn." My aunt, who was probably over a foot and a half shorter than him, turned around and said loudly, "Who is Vince Vaughn?" All Mr. Vaughn did was turn around and look down at this tiny woman who called his name from 2 feet away. My aunt noticed him looking and stared up at him, simply saying, "What?" The crosswalk signal activated, and we all walked in different directions. It was a strange day for sure. I didn't realize how tall Vince Vaughn is. Story 58. I had the opportunity to be formally introduced to Queen Elizabeth. She was a pleasure to talk to. A lovely lady who reminded me of a little grandmother in the nicest way possible. Story 59. River Phoenix was a manager at a Holiday Inn in Nashville in the early 1990s. They were filming The Thing Called Love towards the end of 1992. River and Peter Bogdanovich were staying with us. River was polite and kind to the staff. He would talk to the people at the front desk and the bell staff for hours. Several of them brought home-cooked meals for him, as I believe he was vegetarian. He rarely left the hotel except to work. He seemed to genuinely be a nice person. Unfortunately, he passed away less than a year later. Story 60. Admittedly, it wasn't me. It was my uncle, but it's just a fabulous story. My uncle is a loudmouth gay man who embraced absurdist humor about 50 years before it became popular. He saw a woman who was very dressed up and almost out of place. For some reason, my uncle decided to shout, "That looks like Beyoncé." He forgot he worked very close to Jay-Z's Manhattan studio. So when he shouted that, Ms. Knowles Carter herself turned around and replied, "It is Beyoncé." He left, embarrassed, without saying a word. Story 61. LeBron James greeted him and then walked away. Violet Myers discussed anime for a while and shared recommendations for the best places to eat in Las Vegas. Story 62. The most famous person would probably be Pope John Paul at the Vatican. He touched my forehead. The coolest famous person would be Joe Strummer from The Clash. He was very interesting and kind. Ray Charles was also very kind. I've also met Dustin Hoffman, Clem Burke from Blondie, Willie Nelson, and Burt Reynolds. Dustin Hoffman was not very nice, but Clem, Willie, and Burt were wonderful. I also know most of the Jackass crew, and they are exactly as you would expect them to be and a lot of fun. Story 63. Taylor Swift. This was around 2008 or 2009. She was definitely huge, but not to the level of popularity she has now. It was relaxed. She was nice. Someone I was friends with in college was a childhood friend of Taylor's, and Taylor came to visit her for a night or two. Story 64. I met President Biden during his 2020 campaign run. We exchanged greetings and took a picture. I thanked him and told him, "Give them hell, Mr. Vice President." He responded quickly, As Harry Truman used to say, I'm not going to give them hell. I'm going to give them the truth, and they'll think they're in hell. It was a memorable exchange. Story 65. I met James Woods once in a Holiday Inn elevator in Rhode Island with my girlfriend at the time. This individual hit on my girlfriend and invited her to his room to party. He was 60 years old and made this comment right in front of me. When I stepped towards him, he threw his hands up and said, "Hey, it doesn't hurt to ask." I responded, "It will hurt to ask again." He immediately had a shocked expression for a split second, then laughed and claimed he was joking. As we got off the elevator, my girlfriend remarked, "Ooh, a piece of candy," while I simultaneously flipped him off. If you're reading this, James, I hope you regretted your actions that night. Story 66. I met Alex Turner of the Arctic Monkeys and Shadow Puppets in 2016. I shook his hand, told him he was a hero, and got a photo. The concert was great that night, and I felt amazing for the rest of the day. I also met Kevin Parker in 2012. That concert was fantastic as well. Story 67. Kieran Culkin is really nice. It actually took a few minutes for me to realize I recognized him from The Neighborhood. I've seen one or two interviews where he talks about his kids and how much he loves being a dad. It's absolutely genuine. Story 68. Bill Murray once took a French fry from my plate and ate it. Then he said, "No one is going to believe you, kid," and walked away. Story 69. Steve Martin is polite but shy to the point of seeming aloof. I knew to expect that, so I gave him space and didn't take it personally. Jennifer Lopez can be seen as unprofessional at times. In my previous jobs, I worked with many celebrities. Most of them just wanted to be treated like regular people. Country music artists tend to be the most down-to-earth. Story 70. I have met many people, but one that stands out is when I had a beer with Rick Danko of the band at a small bar in Woodstock, New York, a few months before he passed away. He was a really nice guy. Story 71. Russell Brand was arrogant. Back in 2014, when the allegations and charges were circulating, we regular people had no idea. He was just rude. He came into the bar where I worked to watch his friend's band play. He brought his dog and tipped generously for soft drinks, but the vibes were just bad. Tony Way and Ray Panteke were getting coffee on separate occasions in different coffee shops. It makes me laugh because they are both in Ali G in the house. The best moment was when Henry Rollins walked down the street in East London. I froze, my jaw dropped, and I followed him with my gaze as he walked past. I was too afraid to say anything. The group of friends I was with had no idea who he was and why I froze. Story 72. Taylor Swift was as lovely as anyone could be. Mac Miller was very nice, definitely under the influence. His crew rushed everyone, but he handled it well. Story 73. I met Donald Trump at a Yankees game around 20 years ago. He was with his then-wife Marla Maples, who was about 8 months pregnant with Tiffany. She was absolutely stunning. We shook hands, chatted for a few minutes, and then returned to our seats. He was very pleasant, but I would not want to touch him with a 10-foot pole nowadays. I also met Paul McCartney at Teterboro Airport this past summer. As he walked by, I said, "Sir Paul, thank you for everything." He stopped, looked at me, and asked, "For what, mate?" I replied, "For everything." When he left the terminal, he was waiting outside for his driver. So I approached him one more time and asked if we could take a selfie. He agreed, so I took the picture, which I will treasure forever, as I am a Beatles fanatic. I did not know that he usually says no to selfies. Had I known that, I would not have asked, but in retrospect, I'm glad I did. Story 74. Michael J. Fox had a very pleasant interaction at a music shop in Manhattan. He was gracious and engaged in a short conversation with me. He is a great person. Story 75. Jeremy Irons. I almost knocked him over when I was running around backstage, trying to get back into a theater where I had left my sketching materials. He was quite kind, made some jokes about being able to tell where the Americans were in the theater because of our loud laughter, and signed my sketch of him as Richard II. Story 76. Sir Ranulph Fiennes, the explorer, delivered motivational talks for several major companies I worked with for events. I did some running around after him. He is an extraordinary individual. He cut off his own frostbitten fingers with a saw in his shed because they were too painful, and the doctors were hesitant to amputate. He was polite, charming, and very much the English gentleman, but he clearly gave the impression that he did not tolerate foolishness or nonsense from anyone. Story 77. Meet Kid Cudi backstage at a festival called Bamboozle in New Jersey when his mixtape Dat Kid from Cleveland was a hit. You could tell he was going to be a huge star and generally great to be around. He offered to smoke and I declined. I'm not someone who handles being high well, so it was probably for the best. Story 78. I had a beer with Nas once and I worked for several months with Nicolas Cage. Nas was extremely gracious and put on a phenomenal show. Cage was very eccentric but genuinely a nice guy. He was also very professional. Story 79. Michael Jackson and Jerry Garcia were very pleasant experiences. I worked closely with each of them, Michael Jackson for a couple of days and Jerry Garcia for a couple of weeks over a few years. I also worked with Madonna for an extended period. She was nice but quite demanding. Story 80. I met Chris Hansen the other day. He told me to take a seat. Just kidding, I ran into him at the airport. He is an awesome guy. Story 81. I met Joe Rogan outside of the Comedy Store in 2004, and we chatted for a few minutes. I am not a fan of his recent transformation, but at that time, he was known primarily as the host of News Radio and Fear Factor, and he was a moderately funny stand-up comedian. He was very engaging and friendly. Story 82. Jello Biafra complimented my closing playlist and mentioned that he was once a bit of a headbanger himself. Tom Waits would regularly inspect our sprinkler system in the produce section, then come to the deli and stare at us without ordering anything. Les Claypool was awkward but polite and wrote us a jingle for the local national public radio station because we carried his anti-seasickness ginger beer tonic. Nick Offerman bought a pound of turkey and had recently shaved. We exchanged strange glances as if to say, "I think I know you," while I handed it to him. Weird Al once joined the band that played across the street every Friday and came over to buy a kombucha. Les Claypool joined him when I clocked out and went over for my after-work beer. Phil Lesh and Bob were stopped by the shop fairly regularly. I might be forgetting a few people. It was the worst job I ever had, but working at Occidental was a blast. Story 83. I worked for an entertainment magazine and had the opportunity to interview Richard Lewis. It went well. He had just woken up and spent the entire time making me laugh while sharing details about a dream he had. I also met Shaquille O'Neal and the band Social Distortion. Additionally, I smoked a joint with the bands Fear Factory and Slipknot, but that experience was unrelated to the magazine. Story 84. It depends on people's opinions of who is most famous. I met Patrice Bergeron and he was an absolute gem. I met Bam Margera at a show featuring CKY. He was heavily under the influence and signed the inside of my rolling paper sleeve. Unfortunately, I lost it, which would have been cool to still have. His signature was unique, something along the lines of BAM, but in a graffiti style. I remember being surprised at how short he was. I also shook Bernie Sanders' hand. He is also quite small. It is hard to say who among them is the most famous. I believe Bergeron is the least known, while Bam Margera is the most well-known worldwide. However, Sanders might be the most famous of the three in the United States. Story 85. The King and Queen of Sweden. I lived in a town in Minnesota that has a college affiliated with the Swedish royal family. When I was in 5th grade, they visited the United States to see the college. All of us were taken out of class to go on campus to greet them upon their arrival. We were given little Swedish flags to wave. I didn't interact with them, but I was 10 feet away from them in the crowd when they walked by. The second encounter was with Dave Chappelle. He lived in the same small town in Ohio as my mom, so it was common to run into him. Back in 2016, after a huge night of drinking, I woke up hungover and dragged myself to the coffee shop to get a drink. My hair was a mess, my makeup was smeared, and I smelled like alcohol. I was a literal wreck. In front of me in line at the register was David, paying for his coffee. He turned around to look at me and had to have known I was out of sorts. I became self-conscious and defensive, saying the only thing that came to my mind, "I'm hungover, Dave." He just laughed, said he had a cannabis hangover, paid for his coffee, and left. Story 86. I got to meet Danny DeVito when I was in my early 20s. When I shook his hand, he asked me, "How are you doing?" I looked him in the eyes and said, "I'm tripping balls." And he laughed. On a side note for any hockey fans out there, when I was on a train on Long Island, the Islanders were playing in Brooklyn. A friend and I were on a train completely loaded up with Islanders gear, about to meet some friends for drinks hours before the game. It so happened that two of the players, Anders Lee and Travis Hamonic, were sitting near us, but we didn't want to bother them on their way to work. While waiting for the doors to open at the last stop, Hamonic deliberately elbowed me in the side with a smirk and said hi. I told him that I knew who he was but didn't want to bother him. We had a laugh about it, and I told him I'd see him later and to have a good night. Story 87. Alan Alda was very nice. I was a kid, so I don't remember much else, but I was fully aware of who he was. Story 88. Stephen King is very nice, relaxed, and easygoing. I met him in the parking lot of my hometown mall. He was even nicer than I could have hoped for and very funny. Story 89. Being a bartender and whistler in the mid to late 1990s, I had the opportunity to meet many famous people, and what I found is that they are just people. I've never met anyone who was rude. From Ryan Reynolds to Bill Murray to Ginger Spice and many in between, all were very pleasant. Story 90. I was volunteering for a music festival at the location where people would pick up their wristbands. I was at the artist table, which mainly involved checking the IDs of local bands and distributing their wristbands, as most of the larger or headline acts had staff to collect their wristbands directly from the organizers. Deerhoof were headlining, and I wasn't very familiar with them. Their singer approached my table to get their wristbands, and I had to ask for ID because it is important to verify identity before handing out items. They forgot to bring ID but grabbed a program book and opened it to their page, which had a photo of them. He is a unique-looking individual, so I recognized him right away and felt embarrassed that he had to show me the program, but he was very nice about it. It was a pleasant interaction, even though I made it awkward for a moment. Story 91. Hulk Hogan would visit a local family-owned restaurant whenever he came to town. He was nice to children back in the early 1990s. Tom Green is as strange, if not stranger, than you could possibly imagine. He often stares off into nothingness while conversing, with blank expressions and a very quiet demeanor. Story 92. Larry Hagman, known for his roles in I Dream of Jeannie and Dallas, was our customer, and I met him on several occasions. He was friendly and even took me on a tour of his property in Upper Ojai. His wife was the kindest lady. They had his headstone from Dallas in their garden. Story 93. Keanu Reeves visited my winery with his friends. He laughed at my jokes, helped me carry bottles and food, and agreed to take a picture with me after paying for his entire group. He was kind, respectful, and sincere the entire time. I highly recommend him. Story 94. I used to edit a lot of music videos in the past, and without a doubt, the coolest rock star was Leonard Cohen. No joke. He was truly impressive. Story 95. I graduated high school with Dwayne Johnson. He was immature and difficult in high school. I'm glad he accomplished what he has, but I have no desire to ever see him again. Story 96. Lana Del Rey. I hung out with her after one of her concerts. She was an absolute sweetheart, and pictures don't do her justice. She is truly beautiful in person. Story 97. I used to work for Hill Harper, who purchased the coffee shop I managed about 8 years ago in downtown Detroit. Most people do not know him by name, but he had a prominent role on The Good Doctor and is very close friends with Barack Obama in real life. I believe they have been friends since college. He is a super nice, upbeat, personable, and handsome guy. I have nothing bad to say about him. Sometimes his positivity seemed a little forced, but it was never toxic or aggressive. He knew all of our names and everything. Story 98. I shook Jack Nicholson's hand years ago and told him I loved his work. He thanked me and walked away. I wasn't lying about loving his acting either. Story 99. I defeated Kieran Culkin in Street Fighter at a barcade in Brooklyn. An hour later, he asked for a rematch, and when he won, he got a bit physical with his celebration. It's a good story. He is a good guy and acts in real life pretty much like he does in the movies. Story 100. President Barack Obama and Mrs. Obama are lovely people, warm, personable, and most importantly, capable of intelligent adult conversation, quite unlike the majority of politicians. Story 101. I met Barack Obama when he was still a senator during an interview at the news station where I worked. He was a really nice guy. He signed a book for me and we talked for a bit. Story 102. Sir Brian May, the guitarist for Queen, was in a hotel lobby when I approached him. I expressed my admiration and shared how exciting it was to meet him. He was incredibly gracious. I tried to keep it brief, but he began asking about me since I was in my last semester of school at the time. We ended up chatting for a good 10 minutes. It is such a fond memory. Story 103. Dick Clark was at the grand opening of an American Bandstand-themed diner, for which I was invited to attend. He was a friendly gentleman. Story 104. I met Meat Loaf once, and he was absolutely one of the nicest and most down-to-earth people I have ever met. We took some pictures, and he held my hand for a long time. He was a very sweet man. Johnny Depp passed me his guitar pick at a Hollywood Vampires show, which was kind of cool too. He is a nice guy. The least friendly famous person I have ever met was Kevin Conroy. He didn't smile or want to talk and didn't seem to care that fans were paying good money to meet him. I was honestly kind of disappointed. I have met a lot of famous people, but perhaps they are the most well-known. The rest are mostly actors from television shows and also a bunch of bands. Story 105. I met Jared Padalecki and he was so nice. I just kept telling him how sweet he was. Story 106. My sister was best friends with Kystyn Ritter in junior high. She was a sweet and unique person who dressed in a gothic and alternative style at a rural school. Story 107. I didn't meet him at the moment, but it was one of my favorite celebrity sightings. 4 of us were sitting at a stoplight off the 405 in Wilshire when John Lovitz was in a car next to us. We looked over, and he could tell we were all happy to see him. He proceeded to pick his nose, smile in a goofy way, and wiped it on the dashboard. We all had a huge laugh after that. I also sat next to Tom Selleck at a sushi bar once. He was honestly a very nice, chill guy. Story 108. A few years ago, I met Patty Boyd, who had been married to both George Harrison and Eric Clapton. She gave a talk about her life and afterwards took the time to greet the crowd. She was warm and friendly and didn't rush anyone, leaving a very positive impression. Story 109. I met Alan Tudyk and he was incredibly sweet and nice. The best part was that I made him laugh while they took our photo. Story 110. I used to work at a Barnes & Noble that James Patterson visited. I met him 4 or 5 times. He was rude each time. Story 111. Dave Grohl. I attended a wedding at a summer camp, and he was a friend of the bride's family. It took me a while to believe it was actually him and not someone who just happened to look like him. The father of the bride introduced me to him later that first night. After introducing myself, I told him that the first album I ever bought was Nirvana's Nevermind, and the first concert I ever bought tickets to was for Foo Fighters. He responded with something like, "Wow, that's incredible," and thanked me. Then he commented on my last name and asked if I was related to a roadie for Motorhead with the same last name. I said I wasn't, and he said, "That's good." He got arrested for mailing himself drugs on tour. He was a crazy dude. We chatted for a bit about music, and then the father of the bride suggested we take a picture. My eyes were closed in the first picture, and Dave insisted we take another. The wedding had a summer camp theme, and the guests stayed in bunk beds in the cabins at the camp for the entire weekend, including Dave. He was with his whole family and primarily focused on spending time with his daughters, who were very young at the time, doing activities like a zip line and making tie-dye t-shirts. However, he waved and said hello to me nearly every time we crossed paths at the camp. On the last night, they had a talent show, and he performed a cover of the Beatles' "I Want to Hold Your Hand" with the bride's sister. He was also supposed to perform with his youngest daughter, where he would play the drums while she did gymnastics, but she got shy. He suggested that he would just play the drums, and she could join if she wanted, but she shook her head no and tightly hugged his leg, so he left the stage with a laugh. Super nice dude. Story 112. Princess Diana visited the high-profile location where I worked in London one day, accompanied by a personal shopper. My manager handled the shopper while I was left with Diana, who repeatedly tried to catch my eye. My manager was wearing a transparent mesh top with black tape over her nipples. She had initially worn it with a jacket, but had taken the jacket off because she was warm. Diana was amused by the situation, giggling and blushing, while I simply raised my eyebrows and shrugged. After they left, my flustered manager expressed frustration about spending more time with the shopper than with Diana and asked what we had been laughing about. I pointed to my manager's mesh top and reminded her of her outfit. The look of horror on her face as she realized what she was wearing was unforgettable. I never let her live it down. Story 113. I've met a few famous people, but the most interesting was George Jung, one of Pablo Escobar's cocaine distributors in the United States, the day he got off parole in Ocean Beach, California. I was just hanging out when he walked through the door. Someone quietly said to the security, "Do you know who that is?" "That's George Jung." That definitely got my attention. I ended up buying him a beer and talking with him for quite a while. I took some pictures with him and his niece. He was honestly nothing like I expected. Really relaxed and surprisingly approachable. Given his history, it was surreal. He passed away not long after that, which makes the whole experience feel even more like one of those random, unforgettable moments in life. Story 114. The person in the office next to me is the child featured on the golden record from the Voyager probe. He is very nice. The interesting part is that he is a former Star Trek writer, and I prefer Star Wars. Story 115. Mark Cuban was outside a hotel in Vegas at 6:30 a.m., waiting for his car. I greeted him, asking, "What's up?" He replied, "Waiting on my car." It was the perfect conversation for that early hour. Story 116. Bill Clinton. I was on roller skates with my daughter in the historical center of Cartagena de Indias in Colombia one Sunday morning when Bill suddenly appeared, walking up with a couple of bodyguards. I shook his hand. My daughter asked, "Who is that?" Story 117. I recently met Bret Hart at the airport, and he was impressive. Ricky Martin was incredibly kind and generous. Jimmy Fallon had a playful personality. Gilbert Gottfried has a unique way of speaking. Wolf Blitzer and Anderson Cooper were both nice and had an amazing sense of humor. Ryan Reynolds was laid back. The bassist of the metal band Mastodon was fantastic, and I lost my composure around him, which made him blush. Chris Rock was pleasant, and it was cool to see him. Everyone went silent at first, then the restaurant returned to normal. I almost met Brad Pitt, but his security went to the wrong location. Living in New York City, you end up meeting the most random people, and after a moment of surprise, the best approach is to stay calm if you want to interact with them. Story 118. Not me, but this is a story from my mother. Apparently, she saw the band Korn performing in a bar before they became popular. After the show, they were drinking, and one of the band members started talking to her. She immediately responded, "Not interested." Story 119. Jason Momoa attended a signing for his vodka, taking the time to take pictures with everyone who showed up, especially with kids away from the vodka display. He was charming and even hugged my child, complimenting her sweatshirt and her mixed-race ringlets that formed a loose cloud around her head. To this day, whenever we watch one of his movies, we talk about how wonderful those 30 seconds were. Story 120. I met Adam Sandler in a surf shop around 2008 or 2009. He was one of the most genuinely friendly people I've ever met. He had his Zohan hairstyle, so we didn't recognize him at first. He was a really nice person. Story 121. I used to work in the music industry. My absolute favorite artist to work with is RZA. He is kind and genuinely grateful. I still have some voicemails of him calling to thank me for getting his releases out on time. The worst experience was with Gene Simmons. I might still have voicemails of him yelling at me for not adding enough hair on his head for his album cover. He also behaved inappropriately with my assistant at an event. Total jerk. Story 122. Taika Waititi attended a wedding I was invited to. At the time, I was a huge fan because of What We Do in the Shadows and his earlier work. No one I was with knew him except for his entourage, but I'm not one to chase after celebrities. Even they should enjoy a regular night once in a while. I spent most of the time admiring from afar, which incidentally meant a lot of smoke breaks. Eventually, I ended up behind him at the bar. I complimented his suit, and he told me he had been admiring my look all night. I was thrilled. At the after-party, my boyfriend ended up playing pool with him as his partner, but he was too intoxicated and played poorly. Taika commented that his partner was rubbish. My boyfriend will never live that down. Anyway, he's just as smooth, well-spoken, quick, and quirky as he appears, and his hair was marvelous to behold. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.